Long before their reports shaped the planning for D-Day or exposed the secrets of V-2 bases, the men of the OSS entered the war in the most fragile and dangerous way possible. They arrived alone, at night, falling through the wind in silence. From North Africa to England, from Scotland to secret airstrips hidden in farmland, OSS teams trained for the moment they would drop into a continent controlled by Hitler. Their mission was simple: to vanish behind enemy lines, to gather intelligence, to guide resistance fighters, and to sabotage the arteries of the German war machine. But to do these things, they first had to get into Europe without leaving a trace, and that meant jumping into darkness from a slow C-47 with nothing but a parachute, a code book, and the knowledge that if they were caught, they would disappear forever. OSS training prepared them for this. At secret camps in the United States and Canada, including the legendary Camp X, they learned how to become ghosts. They studied lockpicking, explosives, and the art of silent sabotage. They practiced hand signals, cover identities, and the ability to disappear into a crowd within seconds. They mastered coded radio transmissions and learned to send a burst of information in only a few seconds. They ran through forests with rifles, crawled through mud during night exercises, and spent hours memorizing maps of France, the Netherlands, Norway, and the Balkans. By the end of the training, they were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were shadows. The journey into Europe always began the same way. A C-47, stripped of markings, lifted into the night sky with the sound of engines muffled by wind. Inside the aircraft, the OSS team sat on wooden benches, wrapped in dark clothing instead of uniforms. They carried no dog tags, no patches, and nothing that could reveal their identity if captured. The jumpmaster gave a simple briefing over the engine noise. They would fly low to avoid radar. They would navigate by moonlight and coastline. They would drop miles from any German patrol. And once on the ground, they had 30 seconds to clear the landing zone before the Germans realized a plane had flown overhead. As the plane crossed into occupied territory, the world below was a patchwork of faint lights, quiet villages, and long dark roads patrolled by German vehicles. For many OSS operatives, the moment the red light came on inside the plane was the moment everything became real. They moved to the open door, felt the cold rush of night air, and watched the ground blur beneath them. Some felt fear, others felt calm. All understood that the next few seconds would determine whether their mission even had a chance to begin. The green light flashed. One by one, they jumped. The fawn was silent except for the sound of wind tearing past their ears. The world below expanded quickly from darkness into detail. Fields, hedgerows, orchards, and rooftops snapped into view. The parachute jerked open with a force that knocked the breath from their lungs. Each man drifted toward the earth like a shadow caught on the wind. The goal was not just to land safely, it was to land invisibly. No shouting, no flares, no lost equipment. When their boots hit the ground, they collapsed the parachute instantly, burying it under branches or dragging it into a ditch. Everything after that moment had to happen fast. They checked their radios and code books. They brushed away footprints. They moved quickly toward the nearest tree line. From the moment they touched the earth, they had to vanish. If a German patrol stumbled across a parachute or a set of tracks, the entire region would flood with guards, dogs, and roadblocks. The OSS learned to erase themselves, to make the Earth show no sign of their arrival. By dawn, the team would be deep in the countryside. They changed into civilian clothing, carried in small waterproof bags. They hid their weapons under coats or inside satchels. They walked like locals, their posture and rhythm carefully practiced. Only after reaching a safe location would they attempt their first contact with the resistance. A French farmer might let them sleep in a barn. A Dutch family might provide bicycles and bread. A Norwegian fisherman might lead them through forest paths known only to locals. Often, no words were exchanged. Everyone knew helping an OSS agent meant risking execution. But the war had hardened the hearts of occupied nations. They would help the strangers who fell from the sky because the strangers carried hope on their backs. German forces knew something was happening in these regions. They found cut telephone cables, destroyed rail lines, blown bridges, and strange sabotage marks that did not match local resistance patterns. They even found the remains of parachutes caught in trees or torn fabric buried in soil. They even intercepted short-coded radio bursts that lasted only seconds. What they could not find was the enemy himself. OSS teams moved through the countryside like whispers. They slept in a different place every night. They stored nothing. They left no notes. They traveled in pairs or groups of 3, and they avoided patterns so effectively that German patrols could spend weeks searching a village, only to learn that the OSS had passed through days earlier. In the countryside outside Le Mans, a German unit once investigated a field where a farmer reported hearing unusual sounds during the night. They found faint footprints in the dirt, but no parachutes, no equipment, no campfire, no tracks leading out of the area. The OSS team responsible was already miles away, walking along hedgerows and leaving no sign of their passage. One German sergeant told his commander, "They were here, but they left like ghosts." Part 1 ends with an image that captures everything about OSS infiltration. A quiet French field just before sunrise. Dew on the grass. A collapsed parachute shoved beneath a hedgerow, nearly invisible unless you stand directly over it. And somewhere in the distance, 3 men in dark coats disappear into a line of trees, their footsteps fading into the morning. Behind them, there is no trail, no clue, nothing for the German patrol to follow. The invasion of Europe by shadow has begun, and the enemy does not even know it. Once OSS teams were safely inside occupied Europe, the real work began. They did not storm bunkers or ambush convoys like soldiers on a battlefield. Their war was quieter and far more delicate. They fought the German war machine by targeting the one thing it depended on more than tanks or guns: communication and transportation. Wherever OSS teams operated, telephone lines failed without warning, bridges collapsed in the night, rail tracks buckled from carefully placed charges, German supply depots lost power, train schedules shattered, entire garrisons woke to confusion, and yet, when patrols rushed to investigate, the saboteurs were already gone. It was a war fought in minutes, solved in seconds, and repeated night after night until German commanders began to question whether invisible armies were moving through their territory. The most common and most effective mission involved cutting telephone lines. German headquarters relied heavily on wired communications to coordinate troop movements, direct artillery, and request reinforcements. Radios could be intercepted, couriers could be delayed or ambushed, but telephone cables, buried shallowly beneath roads and fields, tied the occupation together like veins. OSS agents learned exactly how to sever those veins. The operation was simple but risky. Under darkness, often only an hour after curfew, an OSS two-man team would approach a road where cable poles ran in a neat line. One man kept watch, while the other dug quietly at the base of a pole, using only a small entrenching tool. When the spade struck the cable, he brushed away the dirt with his fingers, careful not to leave obvious marks. They clipped the cable in 3 places to prevent easy repair, then buried everything again. Total time, 9 minutes. When German repair crews arrived the next day, they rarely found footprints, only an inexplicable gap in communications that often crippled an entire sector's response time. Rail sabotage required greater precision. Germany moved troops, fuel, artillery, and ammunition by rail more than any other method. One blown track at the right moment could delay an entire panzer division for days. OSS teams used small blocks of explosive mica, designed to leave minimal residue. They placed the charge under the inner edge of the rail and set a time fuse calibrated to burn silently for 10 minutes. Then they slipped away. When the train passed over the weakened joint, the rail snapped, derailing cars and blocking the route. By the time German patrols arrived the next day, the saboteurs were already miles away, following pre-planned escape routes through fields and back roads. One operation near Dijon demonstrated the technique perfectly. An OSS team of 3 moved under the cover of clouds at 2 in the morning. They carried nothing heavier than 2 satchels. Reaching the rail line, they placed charges at 3 points to ensure maximum disruption, then disappeared into a vineyard. At dawn, a train carrying fuel for armored units derailed, catching fire and blocking the line for 72 hours. German commanders knew it was sabotage. They searched the region for days. They interrogated farmers. They brought in dogs and cavalry patrols. Yet they found no one. The team had slipped through their fingers like smoke. Bridge destruction required the most daring. In Norway, an OSS-supported team destroyed a small but strategically crucial bridge used to move trucks between 2 fjord-side towns. The operation sounded like something from a novel. The saboteurs climbed down into freezing water, swam beneath the bridge beams, affixed charges to structural joints, and then crawled back out without being detected by the guard posted 20 meters away. The explosion came hours later, sending the bridge into the water and isolating the garrison on the far side. The Germans could tell from the blast pattern that experts had done it, but they could not explain how the team escaped the snow-covered countryside without leaving tracks. The answer was simple. The team walked in the riverbed for nearly a mile before leaving the water, ensuring no footprints led back to them. Many OSS missions were timed down to the second. The so-called 6-minute operations were famous within the organization. These missions were designed to occur between German patrol rotations. An OSS agent would slip into a warehouse yard, attach a magnesium incendiary to a fuel drum, light the silent fuse, and leave before the guard even completed his next turn around the building. The fire would start 10 minutes later, long after the saboteur had blended into a darkened street or vanished into a barn. The Germans were not blind to these acts. They saw the damage. They documented the patterns. They recognized American explosive signatures. But every time they seemed close to catching the saboteurs, the trail ended abruptly. In one case, near Arnhem, a German security team found fresh boot prints near a rail line where an OSS team had set charges. They followed the tracks for almost 2 kilometers before the prints disappeared into a field of harvested wheat. The OSS team had crawled beneath the straw rows, then walked backward for 50 yards to confuse the searchers before slipping through a hedgerow. German trackers could find the beginning of a trail, but never the end. In France's Loire Valley, another OSS team cut telegraph lines and derailed 2 trains in one night. The local German commander immediately deployed 3 companies to hunt them down. Villages were searched, barns turned inside out, dozens of interviews were conducted. Yet the OSS team had already changed into farmers' clothing, mounted bicycles provided by the resistance, and pedaled calmly through villages where German soldiers stood guard. The fugitives became background scenery, ordinary civilians in a landscape the occupiers believed they controlled. Even when German forces uncovered clear signs of infiltration, parachute fabric, clipped cables, burned fuses, or improvised ladders, they could never piece together the larger network behind the operations. Each OSS team acted alone. They knew only their mission, their immediate contacts, and the radio frequency for brief transmissions. This was the strength of their strategy. To the Germans, each act of sabotage looked like an isolated event, committed by unknown agents whose tracks dissolved into the night. Part 2 ends with a scene repeated hundreds of times across occupied Europe. A German patrol stands beside a severed cable at dawn, staring at the damage in frustration. The officer kneels, touches the ground and sees almost nothing. No clear footprints, no tool marks, no cigarette butts, nothing. Behind the nearby tree line, miles away, an OSS team continues moving, calm and silent, preparing for their next target. The Germans see only the results of their presence. The people who caused it remain shadows, already gone. For all the bridges blown, cables cut, and trains derailed across occupied Europe, the greatest achievement of the OSS was not sabotage, it was survival. German commanders, Gestapo operatives, and Abwehr analysts spent years trying to understand how small teams of foreign agents could move through their territory with such precision yet almost never be caught. They intercepted radio bursts. They found sabotage tools. They uncovered supply drops. They discovered coded messages hidden in farms, barns, and abandoned buildings. But the one thing they could never uncover was the network behind it all. To them, OSS activity was a puzzle with half the pieces scattered in the wind. And no matter how aggressively they searched, the picture never came together. The reason was simple and brilliant. The OSS did not operate as a single network. It operated as hundreds of small cells, each one isolated, self-contained, and nearly impossible to trace. The cell system was not a tactical choice. It was the backbone of OSS survival. Every team knew only a handful of contacts. Every contact knew only their own courier. No one had a master list. No one carried a map of the network. If a team was captured, they could not betray what they did not know. This strategy turned the OSS into a phantom force. Germany could feel its presence, but could never see its shape. The system worked like this. When an OSS team parachuted into France or the Netherlands, they made contact with one person, usually a resistance leader or courier pre-selected by London. That person had a second contact, who might provide shelter, food, or transportation. A third contact might help relay coded messages to a hidden radio. None of these contacts knew each other beyond what was necessary. None knew the team's larger mission, only the task they were personally responsible for. When the OSS needed to move, they switched to a different line of contacts, creating new chains, new routes, new identities. Even if the Germans broke one link, it led nowhere. Radio communication was equally elusive. OSS agents used burst transmitters capable of sending encrypted messages in as little as 3 seconds. German direction-finding units could triangulate a signal in roughly 20 to 30 seconds. That gave OSS operators a 20-second cushion, the difference between life and death. They would stop in isolated barns, clapboards, or cellars, set their antenna, transmit once, and shut everything down. Then they moved immediately. By the time German vans equipped with radio tracking gear rolled into the area, the agents were long gone. One German intelligence officer wrote that hunting OSS radio operators was like chasing birds in a thunderstorm. You could hear them for an instant, then nothing. Often, German units arrived to find a warm patch of floorboards where the transmitter had been moments earlier.
The operator had already melted into the countryside, leaving behind no trace except a few fingerprints on a dusty window or a warm lantern wick. More than once, the Germans believed they were close to capturing an entire OSS network, only to discover they were chasing ghosts. In Brittany, for example, an Abwehrteam identified what they believed was a critical enemy cell after finding coded papers in a farmhouse. They raided the home at dawn. They interrogated the villagers. They searched outbuildings and dug up the yard. What they did not know was that the agents had already abandoned that location days earlier. The farmhouse was not a headquarters. It was a dead drop point, used once and discarded. The papers found inside were copies of decoy communications left on purpose. In Norway, the Gestapo investigators intercepted a short radio message believed to come from an OSS team tracking coastal convoy movements. They set up checkpoints along major roads and ordered searches of every village within a 30-kilometer radius. But the message had been sent from a mountaintop cabin accessible only by deer trails. The team had already hiked out through the forest, leaving behind nothing but footprints quickly erased by snowfall. The search lasted 2 weeks. The Germans never found even a scrap of evidence to confirm the agents had existed at all. In the Netherlands, the Germans were convinced they were closing in on a group responsible for multiple rail attacks near Arnhem. They found broken fuse clippings, a footprint, and a half-eaten ration can. They examined every clue. They brought in trackers, dogs, and photo analysts. But the footprint was from a local farmer who had unknowingly walked across the site hours after the sabotage. The ration can belonged to a Dutch teenager who had scavenged near the tracks weeks earlier. The fuse clippings were real, but they led nowhere. The OSS team had operated entirely from bicycles, never staying in one village more than the single night. They slept in barns, in woodpiles, in haylofts, and once inside a church steeple. Their route through the region was impossible to reconstruct because they never used the same road twice. The Gestapo became so frustrated by these mysteries that they sometimes believed the saboteurs were locals, not foreign operatives. But the clues contradicted that theory. The explosives used were American-made. The handwriting on discovered notes was unmistakably English. Radio intercepts used encryption consistent with Allied code systems. Someone from outside the Reich was working inside it, but that someone was always out of reach. One German intelligence officer later said that the OSS operated like fog. You could see it, you could feel it on your skin, but when you reached out to grab it, it was gone. Even high-ranking German commanders grew irritated by their inability to solve these incursions. Reports circulated through Wehrmacht headquarters containing sentences like, "This work is clearly coordinated, but we cannot identify the command structure responsible," and "There must be more agents involved, but we cannot determine who they are." The paradox was this: the OSS left just enough damage for the Germans to know it was there, but never enough evidence for them to understand how it worked. Every puzzle piece pointed in a different direction. Every clue led to a dead end. Every captured message seemed disconnected from the last. Part 3 ends with a scene that played out countless times across Europe. A German officer sits in a dim room, surrounded by maps, radio logs, and shattered pieces of sabotage devices. He draws circles on the map, trying to predict where the saboteurs will strike next, but no pattern emerges. No line connects the dots. Outside his window, the night is quiet, and somewhere in that darkness, an OSS team moves silently to its next objective. The officer sighs, knowing he is fighting an enemy he cannot see, an enemy that exists everywhere and nowhere. The OSS has become what it trained to be, a network of ghosts.
While OSS teams were blowing bridges and cutting cables in the dead of night, another part of their mission was unfolding with consequences far greater than any single act of sabotage. Hidden inside barns, cellars, forest huts, and cramped attics lit only by candlelight, OSS agents wrote the reports that reshaped Allied strategy across Europe. They mapped panzer movements before D-Day. They revealed the supply routes feeding German U-boat bases along the Atlantic. They identified the laboratories and launch ramps of the V-2 rocket program. They tracked troop transfers from France to the Eastern Front. These reports, sent in 3-second bursts of encrypted radio, guided bombers, reshaped invasion plans, and in many cases saved thousands of Allied lives. Germany saw the destruction their information caused, but never understood how the intelligence had reached London. Nowhere was this more important than in the months leading to D-Day. The success of the Normandy landings depended on knowing the exact placement, strength, and readiness of German divisions along the coast. OSS teams embedded in France spent months gathering this information, slipping through villages disguised as farmhands, or traveling by bicycle under the pretense of delivering milk. They observed Panzer Lehr division convoys. They counted rail flat cars loaded with tanks. They memorized insignias on shoulder boards while pretending to barter at markets crowded with German soldiers. When the 21st Panzer Division shifted its headquarters south of Caen, an OSS agent watched the move from a church steeple and transmitted its new location that same night. When Allied generals studied the maps before the invasion, much of what they read had been seen by men carrying forged identity papers and moving quietly through occupied towns. In the days immediately before D-Day, sabotage and intelligence merged into one. OSS teams provided the coordinates of rail junctions that fed German reinforcements into Normandy. Resistance fighters blew those junctions hours later, guided by the locations the OSS had confirmed. Radio messages from the Dutch and Belgian networks gave precise assessments of how quickly German reinforcements could move west. Every bridge down, every rail segment destroyed, every line of communication severed reduced Germany's ability to respond to the invasion by hours or even days. Patton later said that the greatest trick the OSS pulled was not the sabotage itself, but the intelligence that told them exactly where to place it. The OSS also played an essential role in the hunt for Germany's V-2 rocket sites. These weapons, still experimental in 1943 and 1944, threatened to strike England with no warning. They were assembled in secret workshops, tested in remote forests, and launched from camouflage sites scattered across the Netherlands and northern France. Britain's bombers could not hit what they could not find. OSS teams risked everything to reveal these locations. Agents in the Netherlands followed German trucks hauling unusual cylindrical cargo. They sketched strange scaffolding structures hidden in wooded areas. They counted rail shipments of liquid oxygen containers. In some cases, they posed as farm workers to get close enough to smell the fuel mixing sites. Their sketches and radio transmissions gave Allied analysts the first clear understanding of how and where the V-2s were being prepared. When the RAF launched its massive bombing raids on Peenemünde and later on Z-2 staging grounds, it was OSS intelligence that guided many of the strikes. One particular report from a Dutch OSS operative described the cluster of long, narrow buildings near the village of Hellendoorn. He believed they were connected to the rocket program. The RAF verified the coordinates, and weeks later the site was pounded by heavy bombers. After the war, documents recovered from Germany confirmed the site had indeed been a major assembly facility for V-2 components. Without OSS observers on the ground, its role would have remained hidden. Equally important were OSS efforts against Germany's U-boats. The submarine war in the Atlantic was a struggle of intelligence as much as firepower. OSS agents in occupied France watched coastal shipments, noting the amount of diesel fuel unloaded at specific harbors. They tracked the arrival of torpedoes, mapping which bases were preparing for major deployments. They monitored officers' movements and recorded changes in security patterns. Using these small clues, OSS teams built a picture of which U-boat pens were active, which were under repair, and which were preparing to sail.
Their information, combined with aerial reconnaissance, allowed Allied bombers to target the correct pens with precision and helped Allied convoys avoid the deadliest submarine wolf packs. In the Balkans, OSS teams worked with partisans to harass German supply lines feeding the Eastern Front. They reported the movement of armored trains, the stockpiling of fuel depots, and the construction of new mountain roads intended for troop transfers. These reports helped Soviet forces prepare for German offensives and guided Allied bombing raids deep into Yugoslavia and Greece. But perhaps the most dramatic intelligence contribution of the OSS came not from sabotage or observation, but from coordination with local resistance groups. The Jedburgh teams, special three-man units made up of an American, a Briton, and a French or Dutch officer, worked directly with resistance fighters to direct sabotage efforts with military precision. These teams landed shortly before D-Day and orchestrated the destruction of rail lines, communication cables, and bridges at exactly the right times to slow German reinforcements. Their intelligence from the ground confirmed which German units were preparing to move and allowed London to coordinate airstrikes and sabotage simultaneously. Jedburgh teams also helped resistance fighters ambush German convoys carrying fuel and ammunition to the front. In one instance near Chartres, an OSS Jedburgh team destroyed a convoy by directing resistance fighters to fire on the lead and tail trucks. Allied bombers struck the road minutes later, guided by a burst transmission from the team. The convoy never reached Normandy. This single action delayed a panzer battalion's arrival by more than 24 hours. For the soldiers fighting on Omaha and Utah Beach, that delay meant survival. Despite German efforts to intercept communications, OSS reports almost always reached London intact. The use of tiny burst transmitters, combined with rotating frequencies and mobile antenna setups, made interception nearly impossible. OSS operators transmitted from one roof, then dismantled their equipment and used a different roof the following night. They sent coded messages from attics, from barns, from the upper floors of abandoned factories, from hay fields, and even from cemetery watch houses. German intelligence could never pinpoint them. Part 4 ends with the image of an OSS radio operator sitting in a cold attic in Normandy days before the invasion. He taps out a 3-second message containing the location of a German armored column. He shuts off the radio, slips it into a sack of grain, and walks calmly into the street as German soldiers march past below. Hours later, Allied aircraft strike the exact column he reported. The Germans never see the man who sent the message. They never know which attic it came from. But the war shifts, little by little, because of the fragments of information carried through the night by men who lived invisibly among their enemies.
When the war finally ended and Allied forces walked freely through cities once controlled by the Gestapo and the Wehrmacht, Germany began the long process of studying what had gone wrong. Their generals examined battle maps. Their intelligence officers reviewed intercepted messages. Their security police reread interrogation records and field reports. It was then, when the dust settled and the truth could no longer be denied, that they realized something astonishing. They had been fighting not just armies, but shadows. The OSS had moved through their occupation zones like vapor slipping through cracks in a wall. The Germans saw the damage, heard the explosions, found fragments of parachutes, intercepted flashes of radio bursts, and studied the sabotage patterns. But they almost never saw the men who caused it. Even after Germany's surrender, they could not piece together the full network. They had been defeated not only on the battlefield, but in a silent war they never fully understood. German officers admitted as much in post-war interviews. One Gestapo commander described OSS activity as fighting an enemy who was everywhere and nowhere. Another officer from the Abwehr confessed that despite capturing resistance fighters and cracking certain messages, they never located the real American operatives.
He said it felt like trying to swat insects. In a pitch-dark room, you hear the sound, but never catch the thing that makes it. Many German reports written during the occupation reflected this same frustration. They spoke of saboteurs who traveled without patterns, of radio operators who transmitted once and disappeared, of cells that seemed independent, yet somehow coordinated. No matter how many curfews they imposed, how many checkpoints they established, or how many villages they searched, the OSS kept operating. Part of the mystery came from the cell system, which German officers could not grasp even after the war. They were used to hierarchical command structures, centralized control, and long chains of authority. The OSS operated in the opposite manner. Every team functioned like a sealed container. It held only what it needed and nothing more. Even if an agent was captured, he could not reveal what he did not know. This structure created a labyrinth of disconnected fragments. The Germans walked into the maze but never found the center because there was no center to find. Another factor was discipline. OSS agents lived by rules that left no room for mistakes. They never used the same safe house twice in a row. They never took the same road 2 nights in a row. They burned every note within minutes of reading it. They hid their radios in hollow logs, grain sacks, and double walls. They kept their transmissions under 3 seconds. They used bicycle routes that curved through fields where their tracks would vanish. They memorized faces, signals, landmarks, and timings. They treated every interaction like a potential trap. And they moved constantly, trusting no street, no village, no hiding place for long. German counterintelligence depended on patterns. OSS survival depended on erasing them. Even when German units captured OSS equipment, when the war finally ended and Allied forces walked freely through cities once controlled by the Gestapo and the Wehrmacht, Germany began the long process of studying what had gone wrong. Their generals examined battle maps. Their intelligence officers reviewed intercepted messages. Their security police reread interrogation records and field reports. It was then, when the dust settled and the truth could no longer be denied, that they realized something astonishing. They had been fighting not just armies, but shadows. The OSS had moved through their occupation zones like vapor slipping through cracks in a wall. The Germans saw the damage, heard the explosions, found fragments of parachutes, intercepted flashes of radio bursts, and studied the sabotage patterns. But they almost never saw the men who caused it. Even after Germany's surrender, they could not piece together the full network. They had been defeated not only on the battlefield, but in a silent war they never fully understood. German officers admitted as much in post-war interviews. One Gestapo commander described OSS activity as fighting an enemy who was everywhere and nowhere. Another officer from the Abwehr confessed that despite capturing resistance fighters and cracking certain messages, they never located the real American operatives. He said it felt like trying to swat insects in a pitch-dark room. You hear the sound, but never catch the thing that makes it. Many German reports written during the occupation reflected this same frustration. They spoke of saboteurs who traveled without patterns, of radio operators who transmitted once and disappeared, of cells that seemed independent yet somehow coordinated. No matter how many curfews they imposed, how many checkpoints they established, or how many villages they searched, the OSS kept operating. Part of the mystery came from the cell system, which German officers could not grasp even after the war. They were used to hierarchical command structures, centralized control, and long chains of authority. The OSS operated in the opposite manner. Every team functioned like a sealed container. It held only what it needed and nothing more. Even if an agent was captured, he could not reveal what he did not know. This structure created a labyrinth of disconnected fragments.
The Germans walked into the maze, but never found the center, because there was no center to find. Another factor was discipline. OSS agents lived by rules that left no room for mistakes. They never used the same safe house 2 nights in a row. They never took the same road 2 nights in a row. They burned every note within minutes of reading it. They hid their radios in hollow logs, grain sacks, and double walls. They kept their transmissions under 3 seconds. They used bicycle routes that curved through fields where their tracks would vanish. They memorized faces, signals, landmarks, and timings. They treated every interaction like a potential trap. And they moved constantly, trusting no street, no village, no hiding place for long. German counterintelligence depended on patterns. OSS survival depended on erasing them. Even when German units captured OSS equipment, radios, code sheets, maps, and supply canisters, it never led them anywhere. The tools were generic. The code books were often booby-trapped. The radios lacked identifying marks. The maps were smudged to prevent gleaning operational zones. A German analyst wrote after examining an OSS radio, "This device tells us nothing except that its owner was careful enough to leave no signature." That was the essence of the OSS. Every operation left damage, but no identity. Results, but no footprints. Clues, but no conclusions. German officers studying sabotage reports after the war were stunned when they learned how few operatives had been responsible for the chaos. What they believed to be large underground networks often turned out to be only 2 or 3 men. An entire region of cut telephone lines and derailed trains might be the work of one pair of OSS saboteurs working with a single courier. The explosions that halted rail traffic into Normandy were sometimes carried out by teams so small that each man had to place multiple charges alone. German officers could not believe that groups this tiny had paralyzed communications across multiple provinces. They were even more astonished when they discovered how effectively the OSS had guided resistance forces. German security reports described French, Dutch, Norwegian, and Yugoslav partisans striking at exactly the right moment to disrupt troop movements, convoys, or rail shipments. What the Germans did not know was that these operations were often synchronized by Jedburgh teams armed with radio transmitters the size of bread loaves. These small teams, combining American, British, and local officers, provided the knowledge resistance fighters needed to act with military precision. After the war, one German colonel wrote that the Jedburgh teams caused more damage than entire divisions because their attacks struck at the nerve lines of the army, not its muscles. The psychological impact of the OSS was immense. Soldiers on the ground often believed they were surrounded by far more agents than actually existed. German patrol commanders regularly filed reports describing unseen enemies who seemed to strike in multiple places at once. Towns whispered about the silent men who came and went like smoke. After several major sabotage operations, German units conducted mass arrests, confident they would catch the culprits. They rarely captured anyone involved. This left German commanders feeling as if the occupation was riddled with invisible cracks. Every quiet village might hide a spy. Every farmer could be an informant. Every attic might contain a radio. Fear created shadows where none existed, and those shadows helped hide the real operatives, who moved quietly through the darkness. When the OSS was dissolved after the war, and many of its veterans formed the nucleus of the newly created CIA, Germany's former intelligence officers were still studying their